We're going to wait for 1 second for those out there to come in. Or maybe not.
They'll come in when they're ready.
When they're ready, when the main event. Exactly. I'd like to bring to order the San Rafael City Council meeting of Monday, December 2nd, 2019. Ask you to join us in Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We did meet in closed session. I'll ask our city attorney if there's any reportable action.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor. No reportable action was taken in closed session tonight.
Thank you very much for that. Next, open time for public expression and an opportunity for you to address us on anything that you would like to bring to our attention, advice or recommendations, etc. That would be the time. We can't act on your comments, but certainly interested in them. Salama. Good evening. How are you? I've been practicing. Hey, it's only been 8 years. I'm a quick study. I'm going to tell you. Any case, good evening.
Since 2012, excuse me.
Oh, sorry. Only whatever that is, 7 years.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. Salama Laux, the San Rafael representative to the Commission on Aging, and wanted to share that our meeting that we're going to be having this Thursday will be at the Marin Valley Mobile Country Club, and the topic will be California's new master plan for aging. And our speaker will be Megan Burke. She's a policy analyst from the SCAN Foundation. And as we have prepared, when we have the shut-offs of the electricity and other disasters, preparedness kinds of things, we're now having a raffle at each of our meetings for an item to add to your package of preparedness. The one we're raffling off at this Thursday is...
Oh, nice.
Yep.
Excellent.
Okay. The first aid kit. The raffle is free. We just give out the tickets and we pull a number. So be there. Thank you.
Thanks for the notice and all the work you've done. Anyone else? You're also on the agenda later this evening.
Hi, I'm Ida Lochte from the Downtown San Rafael BID, and I'm here to talk about the Tivoli lights, the overhead lighting. And first, I'd like to say thank you to the city for the pilot program for the West End Lighting Project. It was a huge success. We've heard from numerous businesses, neighbors, and community members that they all love the overhead Tivoli light design. In addition to it being easier to install and maintain, we feel that this update in lighting adds beauty, vibrancy, safety, and fun to our downtown in everyone's opinion. The BID Board of Directors, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Merchant Focus Group at the Downtown Precise Plan Charette were all unanimous in wanting the Tivoli lights to extend overhead down 4th Street east all the way to the SMART station. Thank you.
Thanks, Ida. Thanks so much. Anyone else?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
when the public comment's done, I do have an additional closed session item from the last meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Good evening.
Evening. Jed Green. I am a business owner, Five Corners Group on 4th Street. I'm also the treasurer of the bid, and I do want to echo some of the comments that Ida just made. The pilot program has been great on the lights in the West End. Unfortunately, it's created a little bit of problems. It's created jealousy. Everybody now wants it on the eastern side. I talked to Jeff Miller at Extreme Pizza. He wants it going all the way to the train station. He thinks it's going to prevent a lot of the loitering down there. I'm right there on 4th Street as well. I think it creates a safe and inviting environment for everybody. I talked to Mike a little bit at Iron Springs. He really wants those lights, so a lot of jealousy. But
Well,
hopefully we can get something
We
done.
can't have that now, can we?
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for the work you're doing with the bid. Anyone else? Close, Mr. City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The council will recall that it retired to closed session following the regular meeting on November 18 to conclude a closed session that was begun prior to that meeting. No reportable action was taken at that closed session.
And thanks for your report. We'll now turn to the city manager's report.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I have a few quick items. The first one actually relates to the lights downtown. The Economic Development Subcommittee, which is Mayor Phillips and Councilmember Collin, at their most recent meeting had a presentation from our Public Works Director, Bill Guerin, that mentioned that the lighting to extend it down Fourth would be about $98,000. Probably a little more than that, because I just heard that that was to Lincoln, and so it depends on where you stop. Are you stopping at Tamalpais or Lincoln? Or FRA may not let us go to the tracks themselves. So that item came up at that meeting, and they would take about 4 to 6 weeks to procure and then have them hung. So we'd be looking at probably February-ish if those were to go into place. It's something that staff is planning on moving forward with. It's within Public Works spending authority of not having to come back to the council. If the council would like us to come back and put it on the regular agenda and come back and present the item, we can do that. But unless I hear from you that you'd like us to do that, we'll proceed just as we were and start moving forward on that project. I'm not getting any direction, so I'm not allowed to ask for direction.
Okay,
but I guess let me know if
We're
it's
good on
something
that.
that you.
We're good on that.
Okay. My second item is also related to downtown, but I had someone complain today about getting a citation for parking in a red zone, so I thought this was a great opportunity to remind people that there is free parking in all of both city garages and all of our city lots, where you could park for 3 hours through the holidays. It started already and goes through December 31st, so it's something that we try to advertise, but it's not everybody hears about it all the time, so we just want to make sure that people know that you can, any lot and the garages, for 3 hours free through the holiday season as a way to support our local merchants. And then lastly, the San Rafael Lighted Boat Parade is this December 7th, this coming up this weekend, from 5 to 8 p.m. and in the San Rafael Canal. And it's being hosted by the Marin Yacht Club, and there's viewing locations anywhere along the canal, but specifically Montecito Plaza, Beach Park, San Rafael Yacht Club, or Pickleweed Park are good locations to see it. The only thing we're waiting on is to find out if it's going to rain that evening or not, but it should be beautiful in the rain as well, so we just wanted to encourage, it'll happen rain or shine, encourage people to check it out. Thank you.
Thanks. And did you say 5? I've got it on my calendar as 6, but maybe you're right.
I have 5 to 8.
Chief, I'm sorry, is the boat parade 5 or 6 o'clock? Oh,
Okay.
okay. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Jim, for your report. Any questions or comments? No? Okay. The 98, by the way, is, as I recall, considerably less than originally projected. So good job there, Bill. I think it was like 250 or some number like that. We'll now turn to consent items. That is items 4A through 4E, which will be dealt with with a single motion unless someone wished to hold an item. Anyone wish to hold anything? No? Anyone from the public wish to address us on any of these items? That'll be addressed with single motion. Seeing none, we'll close, come back. Is there a motion with regard to the consent items?
Move approval of the consent agenda.
And
Second?
roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Councilmember Collin.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Vice Mayor McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, matter carries 5-0. We now have a special presentation. The main event, I take it some might consider it to be, and so if you'll join me down. Okay. No, why don't you? Is that okay? I'm going to read. But you want to say something?
So we are thankful for everyone being here, and this is kind of a very cool event that we're going to do right here. We've got 2 new members of our San Rafael PD family. Our first is Jesco, who just laid down because he just felt that his master wanted him to lay down. And then we have Blue, who is with Lynn Murphy. So what we're going to first do is we do this every time we get a sworn officer who has a police canine. And we're going to have Officer Anthony Scalercio be ceremoniously sworn in again as a police officer, just kind of reaffirm his oath of office to all of us, and just with his new partner. And then I'm going to have Anthony tell us a little bit about his new partner. The one thing I do want to say is that Jesco was donated to our department by the Sean M. Walsh Canine Foundation, a woman who lost her son in Afghanistan. He always wanted to be a police officer, so she started a foundation for him down in the South Bay. And so far they've raised money and given 26 police dogs to various agencies throughout Northern California. So Jesco is one of them, and we are grateful for that. Several years ago, I was made a deputy city clerk, so this is totally legit. Okay. I'm gonna have you, if you, can you, oh, this is gonna be tough. You need to kind of raise your right hand. Pretend your right hand is being raised. Okay, there you go. I state your name.
I, Anthony Scalercio,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States,
and the Constitution of the State of California
the Constitution of the State of California,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties
discharge the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
at which I am about to enter.
All right, congratulations. Thank you. Thanks. And could you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, my name is Anthony Scalercio. This is Jesco. Jesco is a about 19 to 20 month Sheppenwal. He's hey. So he's half German Shepherd, half Belgian Malinois. So he's very much works like a German Shepherd, but acts like a Belgian, where he is just wiry, as you can see. He's from Guadalajara, Mexico, and he came to us as a dual-purpose dog in narcotics and apprehension. He is absolutely amazing. He protects me. He watches every step I make. When we drive together, he puts his head on my shoulder and just relaxes and hangs out. Maybe not like that, but other than that, Jesco he's been serving the community for about 3 or 4 weeks now. He's doing very well. We're working with him and incorporating him with our entire department and working with our other partners in our teams and integrating him with everybody in the department. And he's doing well. So we got a long career ahead of us, and hopefully we both stay healthy and we can finish that out.
Okay, we have our mental health liaison, Lynn Murphy, and full name, we'll call him Blue Bayou. He goes by Blue here. And their partnership came about in an amazing way. We had an idea about something else, and I called up Guide Dogs for the Blind right here in our fair city and asked about this one thing that I want to do. And they said, no, we don't do that. I said, okay. But Christine said, but what we are thinking about doing is pairing a dog from Guide Dogs, who is a career change dog, with either a police officer or someone else who works with folks who are mentally ill, who are experiencing homelessness, anything that people can really get comfort from a dog. And I said, okay, we're in. We have a mental health liaison, And it took us a few months to iron out all the details. Lynn and her family adopted Blue, and he's probably been actually working for 2 weeks, I think, and he's absolutely amazing. We could not be more thrilled to kind of be pioneering this comfort dog, working with a police department, and just seeing the smiles on folks' faces inside the building and outside, the joy that he brings, and I think just the calmness that he brings to our whole community. I'm going to let Lynn talk a little bit about Blue, and but I really want to thank Guide Dogs. Obviously, we couldn't do this without you. What you do is incredible, and to be part of that in a little way is something I'll never forget, so thank you very much.
So this is Blue. He's a two and a half year old lab golden cross, which is sort of the specialty of guide dogs because of their disposition and their ability to be trained so well. I have to say that in his short time here at work already, he's made a palpable difference both on the street and at the department and in our house. He just brings a lightness and a groundedness, and people are always happy to see him. When he walks into the room, it's always Blue, Blue. And if he's not with me and I walk into a room, it's where's Blue? So he's definitely the star of the show. He's been out on the street for just a couple of weeks, and people find it a lot easier to talk to him. They'll talk to him, and then after the fact, they'll talk to me. And it's been pretty remarkable. And our family is really grateful to Guide Dogs for making this happen. He's been a really incredible addition to just the community at large. So thank you for coming and being here. And we have a special guest who flew in from Colorado. Julie Brooks is here. She was his puppy raiser for 1.5 years, and she flew in even though her flight somehow was not canceled. She made it here. So if Julie, if you'd come up and just say a couple of things about Blue.
Clearly he doesn't remember me at all. Words cannot express my gratitude to Lynn for welcoming Blue into the SRPD family. In my short time here, I've been able to witness Blue making a difference in the community and putting smiles on many faces here. As I started my journey with Guide Dogs for the Blind, little did I know what I was getting myself into with Blue. Blue truly impacted my life and encouraged me to continue raising puppies for Guide Dogs for the Blind to become successful. Guide Dogs for the Blind could not have picked a better career change for Blue. While he was happy to see me again, he knows he has a job, and my heart is full. Congratulations, Lynn.
Maybell, will you hand me that bag?
And lastly, we have a couple of goodie bags for both of our new dogs. They're from Rivertown Feed in Petaluma, who has always been a big sponsor and help to our canine program. So one of those is for you, and one is for Anthony. Well, it's really for the dogs. Yeah. Oh, and they're not supposed to, I'm sure he will not have that in his mouth, James. Yes. We know the rules. And thank you to the City Council for indulging us in this. We do it every so often, but it's really important to us. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for everything. And maybe we can get a photo with all of you and the dogs.
And thank you, Chief, and thanks for the two. You know, we had I'll just make this real brief, a presentation by Lynn at the Rotary the week before last, and she brought Blue. Guess who the star was? Now, this is not disparaging on Lynn, because she's terrific. But the star was Blue. No surprise there. And I still expect to hear a bark out of Jesco make this official. Okay. In any case, we're going to have a quick picture, and then everyone is invited out for a piece of cake to celebrate, and then we'll come back and finish this evening's agenda. out for there. Any case, like to resume the city council meeting of Monday, December 2nd, 2019. We will now turn to, please, thank you. We'll now turn to the public hearing on the Downtown Business Improvement District.
Good evening, Mayor Phillips and members of the City Council. I'm Simon Vong, Economic Development Coordinator with the Economic Development Department. The item before you tonight is the annual assessment for the Downtown San Rafael Business Improvement District, the BID, for the year 2020. Just for some brief background, state law allows for the creation of a business improvement district where businesses within the district self-assess themselves an annual fee in order to pay for improvements and activities which benefit the district as a whole. The intent of the state law is to provide a funding mechanism for business districts to promote economic vitality. The BID was established in 1979, which included approximately 125 businesses. The district was greatly expanded in 2013 to include approximately 700. For the past year, the BID board has held a variety of events and initiatives. Here you can see some photos of the events that took place this past year, including the Cleaning Green Day, Summer Sidewalk Sale, West End Village Celebration, Hops and Vine Stroll, and Trick or Treat. According to state law, to renew the annual assessment, the City Council must first adopt a resolution of intention to levy an annual assessment and set a public hearing. The resolution of intention to levy an annual assessment was adopted on November 18th, 2019. Tonight's meeting is the public hearing on the annual assessment. The purpose of the meeting is to receive additional input from the public on the annual assessment for the BID and to confirm the levy of an assessment for the upcoming year. The City Council must hold a public hearing to consider comments and any protests to the approval of the annual report and or the levy of the assessment. If written protests are received from more than 50% of the businesses in the proposed area, no further proceedings to levy the proposed assessment shall be taken place for a period of 1 year. The BID has notified its members of the annual renewal process through the member communications, including the BID newsletter, notifications on the BID website, and through agenda items at the monthly BID board meeting. For 2020, the BID plans to focus on downtown beautification, marketing, and promotion with their membership and the public via social media posts and email blasts. The BID board has also been actively collaborating with other downtown stakeholders, promoting additional investment in downtown, and supporting local organizations. The BID will continue to produce signature events for 2020, which include many events from years past. Adoption of the resolution has no direct fiscal impact on the city other than ongoing staff time related to assessment, billing, and processing. Provided the BID activities enhance the business climate and commercial activity within the district, this will generate increased sales tax revenue for the city. Staff recommends that after holding the public hearing and accepting all comments, that if no majority protest has been received, City Council adopt the attached resolution approving the BID 2019 annual report and levy the annual assessment for 2020. This concludes staff's report. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Also, key members of the BID Executive Board are here to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks for your report. I have one question, though. It pertains to the approval of the advisory board that comes before us, and it's not in your report. I'm assuming we're doing that this evening.
Yes, it's in the staff report, but that is true. There are 4 new members of the board.
I just wanted to make sure. Thank you. Any questions of staff? Public comment? Either of you wish to make a presentation? You're welcome to, if you wish. Okay. We'll close public, come back. Further discussion or perhaps a motion?
I'll make a motion, and to Ida's point, if you haven't looked at the staff report, there's a nice summary of all the events that occurred in 2019 as well as what is upcoming in 2020. So with that, I make a motion that we adopt the resolution.
And I second that.
Moving and second, roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Councilmember Cullen.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Vice Mayor McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
aye. But I'm looking at the choices we have. Adopt resolution as presented approving the annual assessment for 2019. I come back to the board members. Is the motion adequate to cover the acceptance of the board members? So I want to make sure we've covered that, and I don't think we have.
I think you're
at this
looking at the
point.
general plan.
No, I don't. I don't think I am.
Adopt the resolution, yeah. Look
Right.
Here, under options.
It
of
just talks
reports.
about, the motion was only with regard to the annual assessment, and we also have to appoint the new members.
Yes, so in the staff report, we've included the new members and the existing members. The item before you tonight is the annual assessment. The intention to levy it was done on November 18th. The current item before you is strictly the motion to go ahead and adopt the resolution for the annual assessment. The staff report doesn't explicitly have a separate motion for the appointment of the new board members.
That's a charge of ours, so I'm wondering if we don't need a separate motion
Mayor,
to cover it.
I think if you don't mind, I would love to have a separate motion because I know the council needs to formally approve the new board members. And I think it'd probably be even cleaner to have include it in the resolution in future years, but I think we can handle it just through a motion this year if that works for you.
I would agree, and I do think that we need to add, or have a second motion, which is the adoption of the advisory board appointments as recommended. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
And seconded.
Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Councilmember Cullen.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Vice Mayor McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye. That matter also carries 5-0, 5-0.
Good
going.
catch, Mayor.
We'll move on to other agenda items, general plans 2040 downtown precise plan.
Thank you, Mayor Phillips. Good evening, council members. Thanks for having us this evening. We're going to have a two-part presentation for you this evening. The first part will be focused on an update, update number 3 on the progress towards our general plan 2040 update and the preparation of the downtown precise plan. As part of that update, there'll be one item of action for you, which is to appoint a new steering committee member for the youth seat. The second part of, and Barry Miller, our general plan project manager, will be doing that part of the presentation once I conclude. The second part of the presentation will be focused on transportation issues. We're at a key point where we need to develop the proposed transportation issues so that we can start doing modeling for the general plan EIR. So we have Bob Grandy from Farron Piers, our transportation consultant, who will be here to give another presentation on the very simple world of VMT, SB 743, and local metrics on how to evaluate transportation impacts.
So we're glad to help out if you need.
So there'll be 3 specific questions that we'll be focusing on, seeking your input, and then any other thoughts you may have. But Bob will go through that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Barry Miller.
Very good evening.
Good evening, and thank you. I didn't bring my dog with me tonight. Try to keep it entertaining.
That's why you're
and
further
short.
deeper into the agenda.
Yes. So one of the 24 seats on our General Plan Steering Committee is reserved for a youth representative. The position has been filled by Bella Bromberg since January 2018. She has gone off to college, and we have a vacancy on the committee and a new candidate that we are requesting your approval for, and that is Eleanor Quang. She is a senior at the Marin School of Environmental Leadership. She resides in Terra Linda, and she also served as an alternate on the Climate Change Action Plan Committee. She's very interested in long-range planning, and we are requesting your approval of her appointment to the youth seat. The the resolution is in your packet. With respect to policy development at this stage, we've completed draft policies for 8 of the plan elements, including those related to the topics that you see on the slide. This represents all of the mandated elements of the plan except transportation and environmental justice. On the right, you see the policies that are in development right now. We're actively working on the transportation and neighborhoods policies, and we'll be working with our steering committee on transportation at our January meeting. While the committee's been focused on broad citywide topics, we've been carrying on a parallel process to update the neighborhoods element of the general plan. We have developed an online tool and are working with over 30 neighborhood and community groups to update neighborhood-specific policies in the general plan. One of the outcomes of this process has been to identify priority areas for future detailed plans similar to the Downtown Precise Plan. We've identified as highest priority the Canal area and the Northgate, North San Rafael areas for follow-up detailed plans. We have also developed a draft land use map for General Plan 2040 using a slightly modified set of categories, which was vetted with the steering committee. We're looking at some relatively minor map amendments, which will be brought to the Planning Commission for their consideration in January. We're also looking at a limited range of land use alternatives, which will be tested in the General Plan EIR. These are very primarily based on the amount of jobs and household growth that would be accommodated in the next 20 years. Each alternative will be modeled for its potential effect on traffic, services, the environment, and so on. The final part of the progress report touches on the Downtown Precise Plan. The council received a briefing on the options report at a study session on October 7th. This was followed by meetings with the steering committee, General Plan Steering Committee, and the CAC in October. A number of issues were raised at these meetings related to economics, parking, homelessness, and public space. We are actively dealing with those issues and will be convening one or more focus groups with our business community and downtown property owners in January to talk through some of the ideas and issues that were raised so that we can make sure that those are adequately addressed in the plan itself. We're in the process of working on the outline of the Precise Plan and the outline of the form-based zoning code that will be used in downtown San Rafael. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Grandy and Rafat Ray to walk you through the next part of the presentation on transportation. Thanks.
Good evening.
Good evening. Next slide, please. Or is there?
Andrew wants to know if there's a quiz afterwards, so you make some.
No.
No? Okay. So you can move on.
Thank you.
Okay.
So most of the presentation will be around VMT, but the last part of the presentation includes a few slides on level of service. We'll talk about that as well. But just as a reminder, VMT well, it's a very simple overarching concept. It gets very complicated very quickly. So VMT is the measure of the length of travel made by vehicles. So every trip made with an origin destination, or both an origin and a destination within the city of San Rafael, has a certain trip length. If we add all those together, we end up with vehicle miles traveled by all cars that are making trips in that area. So it assesses the effect of overall vehicle travel, so it's a network performance measure. It does not address performance at an intersection or road segment level. It's really meant to be a broad, overarching measure of travel. And the intent of going to VMT was really to encourage more infill development, more development near transit that was denser, that would generate fewer vehicle trips per unit or per square foot, if you will, compared to trips that are farther away from transit, pedestrian, or bike facilities or walkable areas. So a little bit of an overview. As I mentioned, I'll spend most of my time talking about VMT. A lot of the information that's presented in the staff report or in the accompanying documents comes from a 34-page technical advisory that the state put out that is purpose of which is to help cities and counties who are adopting new VMT evaluation metrics to have some recommendations and also provide the background information on how they got to those recommendations, or what we would call substantial evidence to support those decisions. It doesn't mean you have to follow these recommendations, but it is a starting point. And so many of the data points that we will talk about that are in the staff report come from that document, or they come from the MTC, the regional travel model, where we have information from that model as well in terms of how San Rafael compares to the region. We'll also talk about, as I mentioned, about level of service, and there's a couple of issues there, sort of high-level policy issues we want to get feedback on in terms of what gets incorporated in the general plan, and then in some cases they'll dig a little deeper into actual guidance on how to implement those policies. So there are really 5 areas within the VMT evaluation methodology arena that we have to make decisions on and provide guidance for future studies that are done for CEQA. And those are from metrics to screening to methods to thresholds and mitigation options. And I'll go through each of these briefly in the presentation. Before I do that, though, when we're doing CEQA documents, there are really three different types of projects that we evaluate. There are land use or development projects. That's the most common form of CEQA document that comes before this body. But there's also area plans. So the general plan will have an EIR, a CEQA document. If there's a precise, specific plan that's done, that will have an EIR. So there are area plans as well that aren't project specific but area wide. And then lastly, some transportation projects are required to do a CEQA document. So there are, within this overarching guidance, we'll be talking about how to address each of those project types. For background purposes, the Climate Action Plan that you adopted in May has some guidance with respect to goals for climate action and reduction in it. And it calls for targets that are in line with or more aggressive than the state's targets with respect to GHG reduction. And 38% of the reduction is to come from low carbon transportation. So that includes ZEV vehicles, which don't reduce VMT, but they do reduce emissions. But bike, walk, transit, and carpooling measures, which do reduce VMT. And so it's directly relevant to, I think, the discussions on VMT is the Climate Action Plan that you adopted a few months ago. So one of the issues is about screening. And you are not required to have a screening process. The screening process would essentially say that there are certain type projects, if they meet certain criteria, that do not have to have a quantifiable evaluation of VMT, because that project, if it meets certain set of criteria, would be deemed to generate a less than significant effect on VMT, and all you would need would be a qualitative discussion. So it's really meant to the decision around this is whether you want to have screening to begin with, and if you want to have screening, which projects would be screened and would not be required to do a comprehensive quantitative forecast, if you will, to generate VMT. So examples of types of projects that could be screened, projects within a half mile of a major transit station. So the SMART station, downtown transit center, if you're within a half mile, that's actually in the new CEQA guidance that was adopted this year. The first bullet point, that's the only one that's actually in the CEQA guidelines. The other four are in the technical advisory, small projects. That's really meant to address projects that would otherwise maybe could qualify for a categorical exemption under CEQA. So that's what that 110 trip per day number comes from. Affordable housing, local serving retail, less than 50,000 square feet. So for instance, if you were to place a grocery store in the middle of a residential neighborhood that didn't have groceries and people were traveling a long distance to get to groceries, and it provided that kind of service where it was actually reducing the overall effect on VMT, would be, you could identify that as a type of project that would be screened. And lastly, downtown San Rafael, since most of that is actually within that half mile distance of the SMART station or the downtown transit center, and or major transit lines served by both Golden Gate Transit and Marin Transit that actually travel through the downtown, could be identified as an area that would be screened. Projects within that area consistent with the general plan could be screened from a quantitative VMT analysis. So that's the screening kind of option. The second is around methods. Once you decide that a project's not screened and you have to do a quantitative analysis, you have to do a forecast, what's the tool that you use? So the recommendation here is to use the new Marin travel model that's being developed by TAM. It has been under development for about 18 months and is nearing completion. It's the model that we would actually use to evaluate alternatives for the general plan that we're scheduled to do in January and February, so that's coming up fairly soon. But that same model would be the one that we would use to evaluate VMT if a project was big enough to need a forecast developed for it. You could also, for smaller projects, develop a spreadsheet method, something simpler that would just pull data from the regional model and simplify things. So that's another option if you want to have something that's a little bit streamlined on the VMT side for smaller projects. So that's how we would calculate the forecast if we have to do that. Then the tricky part gets down to the thresholds. How do you set a threshold at which you would define a project as having a significant VMT impact and therefore have to have a mitigation? So there are a couple different options that are available. One is to, and so the one on top, option A, is really consistent with OPR's recommendation, which is that you set your threshold based on a 15% reduction below the regional average. And so you would look at MTC's 9-county Bay Area region. You would look, for instance, at what's the regional average for VMT per capita. If you look at residential, the regional average is 15.3. So that would be your regional average. Turns out that for residential projects, or residential uses, San Rafael is at about 16.2, which is about 6% over that number of the regional average. So you would have to get 15% below. You're starting 6% above. So you've got to actually get about a 21% below, movement, if you will, on that VMT. If you're looking at residential, on employment, it's a much bigger difference. On the employment side, the citywide employee VMT per capita is about 33% higher than the regional average. And that's because you have so many employees who have to commute from outside of Marin to work at jobs in San Rafael. So the trip distance is longer, therefore the VMT is higher than the regional average. So that's an even bigger jump to get 15% below the regional average. You're starting a third higher. So the other option is you could look at, you could compare VMT to the citywide average, not the regional average. That citywide average is higher than the regional average, so the amount you would have to come down if you did 15% below the citywide average is less, if you will. So that is an option, and one of the things that we're going to be doing in the next few months is testing some 3 land use alternatives to the general plan, and that will help inform you, and we'll be able to bring information back to the council on how different land use mixes affect these VMT numbers and the thresholds that you could adopt. So it gives you that information, particularly with respect to option B. In terms of transportation projects, many projects that involve maintenance or construction of pedestrian or bicycle facilities would be presumed not to have a VMT effect, where you're actually widening a roadway. There's a potential for an effect on VMT and generating induced trips, as we call it, more VMT. So those are the types of projects where we would need to look at the net increase in VMT. And then mitigation options. So the principal mitigation option that's identified in OPR's recommendations is trip reduction strategies. So they want to see mitigations targeted towards looking at ways to reduce vehicle trips, whether that be encouraging walking, biking, transit use by projects. You could also look at changes in land use mix or density that could have a positive effect on VMT. The other things that the city could do is adopt a TDM ordinance that has more potentially a monitoring requirement in it to monitor larger projects and their effect on VMT. As it noted here, that would require additional staff resources because that does become fairly staff intensive to do that kind of monitoring. And then lastly, you could amend the citywide transportation fee to include projects which would help reduce VMT, so that if projects contribute to the citywide fee, they're contributing to bicycle and pedestrian and transit related projects that are helping to reduce VMT, so that could become part of the mix as well. So those are all potential mitigation measures that you'd be bringing forward if you found that a project had an impact. So as I mentioned, the next steps in January and February, we'll be evaluating 3 different growth alternatives for the general plan, and evaluating VMT for each of those and seeing how they measure up in terms of relative to each other and also relative to the regional average. Be able to bring that information back to help you make that decision. And then we anticipate coming back in early spring with kind of the final, once we get some feedback from you tonight, bringing back sort of a final package of recommendations for both VMT and LOS. On the LOS side, we spoke in June about sort of 3 principal options. One being maintaining intersection LOS as we do today for projects that require a traffic study. The second is doing an arterial delay index, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. It's a less intensive than intersection LOS, and meant to look at road segments as opposed to intersections. And finally, you do have the option of doing no additional local monitoring as it with respect to intersections or road segments. So the status quo would be to continue to use LOS in the current general plan. One option, if you would like to go down this path, or one question would be whether that would apply to all projects or whether you would screen out projects like we talked about earlier with the VMT. You could potentially screen out projects in the downtown and say you do not need to do LOS if you're located in the downtown. So that's an option for you as well. So if you go LOS, that would be an option you would want to think about as to whether you'd want to screen out some projects from having to do that. The other item that's often considered for cities that are now still doing LOS is whether they want to attach a size of project. So a certain number of trips, if you go over a certain number of trips, you would then need to do intersection LOS. And that ranges from as little as 100 to 800 peak hour trips. So there's a big range in what cities are thinking about in terms of having a trip threshold for intersection LOS. And as noted, this requires a much greater level of time and resources to do intersection LOS because you're looking at multiple intersections and collecting a lot of data around that, compared to the arterial delay index, which is really focusing on a segment. This could be as simple as collecting travel time data along a segment during the peak and the off-peak periods and making a comparison and setting a ratio. In this case, there was an example of a ratio of 2 to 1. So if your speeds are during the peak are half those during the off-peak or less, then you would generate an impact and it'd be something that you would want to address in terms of making some sort of either capacity or operational improvements. And then this would be the option of doing no additional local monitoring and only doing VMT. So that's the presentation. Rafat, I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we go into the council feedback request?
I have nothing to add. We'll wait for the questions.
So there were 3 elements that we wanted to get feedback from the council tonight. The first is that issue of whether to use a locally based VMT as opposed to 15% below the regional average. I will say the 15% below the regional average is a much higher benchmark to clear. It is more conservative, but it is going to be difficult to meet, particularly for projects that would be employment in nature. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be coming back in a few months with some information from the alternatives analysis for the general plan that could help provide additional information for this, but any feedback you have tonight on using that benchmark versus the regional versus the citywide would be appreciated.
Well, first, thanks for your report. And certainly a new area, so we're pleased to be better informed. Questions regarding the report or report of staff, and then we'll go. And we're not sure. Are you going to go to the third, transportation, and then to public, or how do you want to organize it?
I would say at this point, if you have any specific questions based on the presentation, now would be the time to ask. If not, go to public comment.
Okay. On this segment. Okay, questions, comments?
A few
Kate?
questions.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. When you talked about San Rafael's VMT average and you talked about people coming in, isn't that average also include people going out?
Yes.
Okay,
So it's both ends, both
Right,
the origin and the destination.
So one of the reasons we're higher is because we're both a city attractant, or job attractant, as well as people commute to places, San Francisco and elsewhere.
Correct.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, because when you mentioned that, and I had read that in the report. The other question I had about VMT, and to your point, it sounds like, oh, that's straightforward, but when you start getting to the weeds, it's just a lot of iterations. So just from my own understanding, and maybe for the public as well, does the VMT take into consideration the actual makeup of the population? So specifically, it has the whole per capita VMT. And so when you're looking at who are the people in your community, we have an older community, maybe people drive less, and if they have, 4 or 5 kids that are all driving around, is that ever looked at, or is it not sliced that finely?
That's a really good question, and I would say that there's a couple different aspects to that. The sort of immediate response is that, yes, the travel model has both information on the number of housing units, but also the demographics for the people who live in those housing units. And the demographics and the type of unit affect how much vehicle travel is made. So that's all incorporated into the forecasts, and that's information that we can actually influence and update in terms of making sure we have the right demographic information in the model. But that is incorporated. The
Yeah.
other thing I'll add is we calculate total VMT, so that's all trips, but we can also break it down into trips only made by residential, trips only made by the employment side, and those are often done to evaluate residential only projects or employment only projects as you really focus on those trips. So that's a subset, and then even further refined to whether or not we're including just light duty vehicles or also trucks and other trips. So there's lots of different elements about how you do the math, but ultimately it all rolls up into this overall VMT, and that's a number we try to generate. And then if it's a single use project, we go down to the next level, which is either residential or employment only type of trips.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you for that. And then the only other question I had, and it was a mitigation measure, but you didn't get into it as much, as there was a whole section in the staff report. I don't know if people have read it. The staff report was very robust, so well done. It's very helpful. Is on the TDMs, which stands for Transportation Demand Management. And when I read this, I couldn't, it wasn't clear to me if it was both for new projects like ground up, or if it was applied to existing office buildings, because in the staff report it says it's tenant dependent. So I was assuming as I read it that would only be for new projects being built from the ground up from here on out, and it's not as if we're going to go back and talk to offices that are already here and say, hey, do you have a TDM? I wasn't sure how it related to both new and existing businesses. I mean, what we'd want is it to be a part of the entitlement process for newer projects, but if you could just clarify how that relates.
No, you're correct. From the CEQA perspective, it would be for projects that are getting new entitlements, so either adding or changing or new projects. The zoning code, though, does have a provision for employers of a certain size to essentially provide TDM-type programs to their employees. So that's embedded in your zoning code.
So that already exists now. So
that exists now. So
okay, so they were already doing that, and because there's a lot of
over a certain number of employees,
right.
So it's a lot of small employers that wouldn't apply to.
And it wouldn't. We're not talking about applying it to smaller employers going forward.
That's not the way it's currently set up in the zoning code. I would imagine that a TDM ordinance, which might expand on that zoning code provision a little bit and be more targeted to what we're trying to accomplish with the VMT side of the equation, would have similar types of employment limits and say over a certain, targeted to a certain size business.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thanks. Other questions? Mary Beth.
I just want to clarify how the regional target would work with the actual facts here in San Rafael. So let me, I'll tell you what I think I heard, and you tell me where I went wrong. Under the first, the policy 1, the screening criteria, if the project meets the screening criteria, it's good and there's no implications for vehicle miles traveled. Is that right?
So that's generally for projects that are smaller or that are close to transit and therefore presumed to already be a low VMT generator.
So they're part of the good guys.
They would be screened out and you wouldn't need to do the analysis. You're right.
Okay, now we move to the ones where we do need to do the analysis. So because we're here in San Rafael are already 15% above the regional average, and the target is to get 15% below the regional average, that's a difference of 30%. So if a project comes in for a particular parcel, does that project proposal have to demonstrate that it will reduce the vehicle miles traveled from that parcel by 30%, or it cannot be approved?
Depends on what threshold you adopt. If you start with a threshold that's 15% below the regional average, then an average project, and you would probably have a separate threshold for residential and employment, or at least you could consider having a separate threshold for the different land uses. Or you could have one global threshold, which would make it easier for residential, harder for employment. But if you chose to have that threshold be based on the regional average, say for residential is 15.3, and you're already at 16.2 citywide average for residential, then you've got to go 15% below the 15.3. If you, however, use a 16.2, which is the citywide average, you only have to go 15% below that. So that is an option that's offered in OPR, and we still need to provide the justification for doing that, but it would be a smaller reduction that you would need to, if your benchmark was the citywide average versus the regional average, because for both residential and employment, the citywide average is higher than the regional average, so it's just a farther reduction that you would have to make if you use the regional average.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Yeah, but of course, that's all, the goal there is to achieve a less than significant finding and avoid a statement of overriding consideration.
Well,
in other words, the failure to meet the threshold is simply a failure to
Right.
to achieve a less than significant finding. Am I right about that?
that is correct. So
Okay.
projects that do not achieve that threshold would be deemed to have a significant impact, and then we would need to determine if there's a feasible mitigation measure that they could implement. If there wasn't a feasible mitigation measure they could implement, then you would have a significant unavoidable. Exactly,
Sorry,
that's
I
where
j-
you would
I-
end up. And,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
correct.
So actually, but my question is a little different. I found the staff report very helpful until I got to the matrix that was attached as an exhibit. And I found that a mixture of both helpful and confusing. Because what I'm struggling with is the later question on the list of things that you'd like our reactions from. And I'd like a little further clarification, if I could, on what it would mean to retain some LOS, retain LOS as part of our consideration going forward. VMT would be enshrined as the methodology for CEQA purposes, but what's the value of keeping LOS in our toolbox? And when I looked at the pros and cons and the considerations, I came away a little perplexed about the long-term advantages. I sense that the short-term advantage is simply, well, other jurisdictions are doing it, and it may be a useful planning tool, but since at times LOS and VMT are at odds with each other, and you use it as an example, arterial congestion, in coming up with mitigation measures for that, if we use the LOS, to do that might actually affect your VMT calculation, because it could be traffic inducing. So you have these two provisions that are somewhat at odds. The last time we discussed this, I was attracted to the idea of keeping LOS because it's a tool that a lot of people are comfortable with, and they think they do understand it, or at least on the surface. But I'm now wondering if we're creating a complication for ourselves, something that we're going to have to administer. It's going to cause public confusion because you have two different standards. And we're going to be grappling for some time with how we manage these two, and at what point do we decide we're going to go with one and exclude the other.
It depends on how you would use level of service going forward. So you could calculate level of service for certain types of projects or all projects. It would depend upon how you wanted to use that information for disclosure. So you could develop that information simply to say, here's the impact on intersection level of service, and you would disclose that information and essentially just say, here it is, this is what it would be. And as this, you could use that as a basis, as input into the decision you would be making on an individual project, which might lead you in different directions in terms of that project. The other thing you could do is you could actually use that information to inform conditions of approval that you might want to place on the project. It wouldn't be a CEQA impact, but it could be information that you would say, as a condition of approval, you might want to have, for instance, an intersection is now stop sign controlled, have a signal installed, or turn pockets installed at that intersection to support certain movements. When you start getting into adding new travel lanes along a roadway, then you start getting into the question of whether you're inducing trips and getting in conflict with the VMT provisions, which is the goal of which is to reduce vehicle travel. So it does get a little bit tricky, and the cities that have gone the route of including LOS analysis have essentially said that the goal of any mitigations, the principal goal of any mitigations is to do trip reduction or provide facilities to provide for transit or pet or bike options so that you'll try to reduce as many trips as possible. But they still, at least one city, and that I know of, and that would be San Jose, still leaves open the option of implementing capacity improvements as a result of the LOS analysis.
If I may add to this, thank you, Bob. I mean, before we get into the weeds, by the way, my name is Rafat Ray. I'm the city traffic engineer. Before we get into the weeds, I think we do have two competing goals here. One is to reduce the VMT, but we also need to be focused on making the development work with the city fabric. We need to make sure that operationally at the opening day of this business or residential, that the traffic will flow. So we need to be focused on all these things. And the way I think about it is LOS is a tool in a toolbox. We can go to it. It's no longer our standards because we're forced to adopt VMT standards. It's no longer our standards. Many of the cities that adopted or kept LOS, they kept it as a circulation study and not an environmental review. When you have that tool, you'd still be able to use it to make sure that the development is functional through putting conditions of approval, and it could be capacity adding. But if we want to be realistic, where are we going to be adding capacity? I mean, the capacity, if we have to do, let's say, a major housing development in the downtown and we have to add a left turn, if we have a place for a left turn, that left turn by itself on the regional model is not going to make a difference. It's not going to make a significant impact where it would generate VMT, but it will also correct LOS.
And those cities that are doing it are calling it a local transportation assessment or LTA, and they're literally looking just at the intersections right around the project. So are the places where the project's loading to the network functioning, where the parking garages or parking lots are connecting to the main collectors and arterials around the project? Are they working, functioning correctly? And if not, gives you the opportunity to make some adjustments to the project and how that's designed.
I have a question regarding, it's on page 12. Make reference to VMT 2015-2040 based on local conditions of San Rafael rather than simply adopting the state, et cetera. But here's my question. This will result in a more realistic and less onerous target, although is most likely to be less aggressive than the state budget. And earlier you talked about a threshold that would be stifling any further development, or any development, let's say. So I'm curious how we provide meaningful feedback with regard to the adoption of the 15%. I mean, it sounds like a good thing on the surface, but without knowing the consequences, it's hard for me to say that would be a good outcome, and therefore that would be a standard we wish to adopt. So I'm curious how we uninformed as you are, we're uninformed, you are not.
I don't understand.
Oh, I don't understand. Siri, be quiet at this point. How we make that informed decision, because I'm not sure that we're prepared to do so.
And I think we weren't asking tonight for a decision, but any directions or comments you have on that policy decision, I think we do plan to come back with information from the general plan alternatives analysis and the VMT results from that project to be able to give you some very specific numbers, so you'll be able to actually look at a quantifiable comparison of what those two benchmarks would look like.
And I think some qualitative input that, you know, it's really, whether it's extremely important that you see that the climate change action plan goals and reduction of greenhouse gases, that's the most important thing, or whether there needs to be some balance to ensure that there will be development and growth and redevelopment. Those kinds of concepts could help shape the alternatives analysis that we will do to come up with a range of numbers to then show what the different options would result in terms of future growth.
And it'll be helpful, though, to get a sense of what the consequences are. I mean, 15% underscoring the, I suspect we all endorse the climate change action plan, but to what degree? And that's where I'm at loss. And we want to, I think, adopt it to the extent that's reasonable. And therefore, and frankly, I don't know if that's 10, 5, 15. I don't have a sense of what that might be.
And I think Councilmember McCullough alluded to this a little bit, is that whatever threshold is set, there is, the city does always have the option through the CEQA process to make findings of overriding considerations.
Right.
However, that also has to be balanced with, are you going to be in a position where we're going to override every single project that comes into the city, or do we want to have some reasonable amount of growth to, you know, be able to approve without going through the override process?
And that's why I'm asking, because we need to be pretty clear, I think, with those that are perhaps considering the development. We may favor that or we might not, but it would seem to me that we ought to give them a pretty clear signal as to what our intentions are, not just, well, that sounds good. So I would hope that they're, mechanically, let me understand just a little better than I now do. I don't want to take, and it's probably totally inappropriate, but I'll take it anyway. Costco. Costco will attract a number of shoppers, so VMT from a distance, but it also, let's assume if it's in place in Terra Linda, will be partially offset by those that might otherwise travel to Novato for Costco. So do you net those, or how does it work in that example?
In that case, what you would do is two model runs. You would do a model run without the Costco in place with the current land uses, and then you would substitute the project as it's described with Costco and any other elements into the model in that location, and you would do a model scenario-based comparison. That's really the only way to pick up whether or not the trip links are actually getting shorter. I think your question is, do the trip links get shorter because people are traveling to Novato instead of traveling from Central or Southern Marin? And what's the effect on trip length? And the only way
I'm looking at an individual, I guess two individuals, those that might be coming to Costco in Terra Linda.
Right.
And then I'm looking at the number of individuals in that area,
right,
however defined, that would otherwise be going to Novato to shop at Costco, but now since there's one in their backyard, they don't make that trip. So I'm asking if those net against each other.
They would if we did two model runs, one without the Costco in Terra Linda and one with the Costco. We would see the net difference. I'm not sure what that net difference would be without making the model run, but that would be the way we would do it.
So it is a net.
You would look at, in that case, you would look at the net, because that's the only way to do a comparison for that project.
Okay.
Or the difference, the delta between the run with and without Costco.
Andrew, I think it's
If I
follow-up.
could just extend that, though, in this process of modeling out the presence or absence of a Costco in Terra Linda, you're looking at something more regional in nature than simply traffic or vehicle miles traveled within the city limits. Despite whatever threshold you're using later on in your analysis, you're looking at how many people who are coming, say, from Southern Marin are stopping in Terra Linda to go to the Costco there, as opposed to continuing on to Vintage Oaks. Are you not?
That is correct. And what the difference would be if you had two facilities, essentially, versus one in the county. And by the way, it'd not only be the patrons, but also the employees and the deliveries. All those things are factored into the VMT equation. So what would be the difference?
Is it, I mean, just thinking about that process of accumulating the data to make that presentation seems pretty overwhelming. Plus, it seems that it includes a number of assumptions. I mean, I don't know how many are going to Costco from Terra Linda, maybe you do, but I suspect you'd have to accumulate that. And is that a terribly onerous task for, I know we don't have a choice on this, I get that, but I'm just curious. Is that a terribly onerous task for our staff to accumulate that?
Well, to use the TAM regional model to do that forecast is, I would say, not a terribly onerous forecast, but we'd need a lot of information to be able to understand how to put that into the model. So we need to ask a lot of questions about the project. But with those questions answered, we could have that data integrated in the model, make runs, create 2 different forecast runs, and do a comparison of the VMT for that area, essentially the whole Northgate area. We draw a circle around it, say how does the VMT change?
And who are we asking the questions of?
We would need to have information about the project description.
But I mean, are we asking the prospective developer, or I don't know who to ask. Would that be reliable? I'm wondering.
It'd be underlying information about numbers of square footage, number of employees, that kind of information. A basic project description information.
May I just add a perspective here?
Yes, thank you.
The models that we're talking about are macroscopical, and it's not microscopical. Let's just keep that in fact in sight, because we're asking the model to be way too accurate, and it's not intended to do that. The kind of questions that you're asking will probably have to come from a specific retailer with shoppers with certain kind of zip code that are already now going to Novato from southern Novato. And that information would need to be somehow injected into the model in order to improve its accuracy. But from what I know, I don't think that these models are the silver bullets. They're simulation models.
Yeah.
And we're asking for data that are too high resolution data for a specific project. I mean, this is the county. We're modeling every household, every movement in the county, and it's not going to be sensitive with a project as big as Costco. It might inform us on some VMT, but it's whatever we put in the model to extract. And if feel free to.
We have ways of getting sources of data that don't involve going to the applicant when it comes to travel made by projects. Essentially, any cell phone device gives us data, and we can purchase data on trips made from any area, as long as it's not too small an area. We cannot purchase data for privacy purposes down to the household size, but if we draw a big enough circle around, say, the parking lot of Costco, and admittedly you'll have a little bit of overlap with other uses, if we drew a circle around that, we could track over the course of a year every trip that's made in and out of that parking lot, and where it goes to on a zip code basis, if you will.
Yeah, but we're talking about Costco. It's a new facility, and so there's no data available on it.
Talking about the existing facility. If you're trying to track uses at the existing facility in
But it would be, by definition, it's a new project. So
right.
what information is available on a new project, and certainly not that you've suggested. It's interesting. I just have one follow. I received, I think it's fair to say we received, a letter from Responsible Growth in Marin, and there's a chart, Exhibit 3, that I don't quite get, and maybe somebody can help me. It's this one.
I think that chart is a chart that shows the household VMT per capita for all of the cities in Marin County and compares it to the regional average.
Okay.
It's not total VMT, it's the VMT generated by households. And what that shows is that San Rafael's household VMT per capita is about 6% above the regional average.
Right.
So you see it's slightly above the regional average.
Right.
And I think the question in the letter is about how that relates to the 15%.
Correct.
The 15% is more of a 15 to 20% of more of a broad citywide average. This is residential only. As I mentioned previously, the employment is 33% above the regional average. So you're looking at residential at 6, employment at 33. the citywide average is going to be in the middle. And so that's where this 15% is an attempt to bring a blending of those residential employment uses into the percent above the regional average.
Okay, it's an area I need to better understand.
But that's the
because
difference between
you're talking
6
about
and 15.
plus 15, 30. I don't understand, just sitting here without any real knowledge, how a project would meet that standard. I mean, that just intuitively seems almost impossible.
You're correct. Well, let me just say one thing.
Afraid you're going to say that.
Projects located within the downtown around the transit center, whether it be residential or employment uses in the downtown, would have a much easier time meeting any VMT threshold because those projects have access to transit. They have more of a walkable, bikeable grid network, if you will, a walkable grid network to get to those transit services. So they'll have a much easier time getting to a 15% reduction below the regional average. If your starting point for residential is 6% above, for residential, you have to get 15% below, so it's about a 20% swing for residential. That's more doable in the downtown. Once you get outside the downtown, it's going to be much tougher to make that 20% swing from 6% above to 15% below. For employment, you're 33% above the regional average. So getting to 15% below is a big, big reduction.
Right.
And that's going to be very difficult to get 15% below the regional average on employment. I would say there's probably very limited number of projects. They would probably be ones in the downtown that could meet that kind of goal. So what that means is if that's your threshold, it's 15% below the regional average, then most employment projects and most residential outside of the downtown that are of a certain size and not screened out would result in a significant VMT impact and have to have a VMT mitigation.
So we better be careful at 15%. I want to go on, but thank you, and I'll open public comment regarding the item. Whoop.
That's okay.
Okay.
Good evening. I'm Grace Garrity, a resident of Terra Linda for 32 years and a leader of Responsible Growth in Marin, a grassroots community organization of concerned residents and businesses advocating for responsible growth in Marin County. To date, we have 2,055 strong and growing. Our organization, RGM for short, understands that the city has a mandate from the state of California to use vehicle miles traveled, VMT methodology, for purposes of assessing traffic impacts for projects subject to review under California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. However, we also understand that State Bill 743 and the state CEQA guidelines do not require lead agencies to abandon level of service, LOS, for purposes other than CEQA analysis. In fact, some agencies have maintained LOS requirements in their general plans, for example, the City of Novato and others. We strongly recommend that the city continue to use LOS as a condition for approval under merit review of proposed projects while using VMT as the state mandates for CEQA review, and that the city continue to use intersection LOS for areas where that is appropriate, such as suburban neighborhoods like Terra Linda. Our rationale is very simple. San Rafael was a pioneer in adopting LOS standards and has used them effectively for decades.
If you could wrap up your comments.
We have Laura Silverman, who's willing to give up her time for me. Developers and the public are familiar with LOS standards and how they are used. LOS is the best tool for measuring local traffic conditions which strongly impacts residents and businesses in San Rafael. LOS can also be a tool for reducing green gas emissions and air pollution, since cars idling in gridlock traffic substantially increase emissions, and this is not measured by VMT. Using LOS methodology solely for transportation planning and removing it from San Rafael's project review process denies the city a substantial tool for guiding growth, requiring alterations in projects, and mitigating traffic impacts. Intersection LOS methodologies are more appropriate than arterial LOS methodologies for suburban areas outside downtown. And other agencies are using, as I said, both methodologies, VMT for CEQA and LOS for consistency with general plan. We are concerned that categorically across the board, waiving traffic below proposed thresholds for size or timing of project will prevent the city to manage cumulative traffic effects and hinder the city's timely planning for transportation improvements. RGM recommends that traffic studies not be categorically waived through the use of thresholds, but perhaps be considered on an individual basis. I know it's harder, but it makes more sense. RGM further recommends that San Rafael maintain development timing policies to prevent the city's growth from outstripping its transportation network and infrastructure. We support the staff's recommendations for continue trip-based traffic mitigation fees to contribute to transportation improvement. Sincerely appreciate your listening to our concerns, and we thank each and every one of you for your hard work and diligence and striving to develop a thoughtful general plan 2040 that will leave a legacy we're all proud of.
And thank you for your comments.
Mr. Mayor, do you mind?
I think Andrew had a question.
Just one question. And Ms. Garrity, since you were the lead author or signatory on the letter we received today, I'm going to ask you, and if you'd rather defer to someone behind you, that's fine. The issue that came up late in our conversation with the consultant highlighted a point in your letter that either was an intentional or inadvertent misstatement about our baseline VMT. Do you care to comment on that, or is that something that someone else wishes to comment on when it's their turn?
We have another expert that will discuss that with you.
Very well, because that concerned me a little bit based upon what we've heard this evening, that perhaps your letter was altering the facts a little bit in a way that certainly supports your position, but may not be entirely fair to staff in the analysis and the hard work that they've done for the past several months.
We'll be glad to clear that up. Thank you so much, all of you, for reading our letter. We sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.
My name is Pam Reeves. I'm a Terra Linda homeowner and business owner, and I appreciate the time here to talk with you tonight. I just have to say, probably like everybody here, how difficult it is to wrap your mind around some of these details, and I've really appreciated the staff report. And the next thing I'd like to say is I think we're lucky to have an award-winning traffic engineer in Rafat Ray. I did look up background and try to understand vehicle miles traveled versus LOS and arterial and collector roads related to North San Rafael versus downtown San Rafael, Novato, Walnut Creek, and how extremely different North San Rafael is. For example, one of the arterial routes is Freitas Parkway. It goes not very far, and it ends in a dead end. And in the beginning of that arterial is very busy. The end of it is not busy. So the minor arterials and the major arterials in North San Rafael are so different because they don't have the speed is irrelevant. And I just want to, as compared to downtown, because we don't have the signaling that are timed, it's intersection congestion. And an offside issue of this, but is extremely related and important, is I live on Las Colindas Road, and that has now become a highway in my mind, because I no longer can back out of my driveway with any ease because people are circling around the heavy congestion on Freitas, and they're going 40 miles an hour down a 25 zone. They're not stopping at the stop signs, and I think this is a direct result of congestion. And people being upset with how long it takes to get through the intersection, the greenhouse gases that it makes. Am I out of time yet?
Almost. Now
Yes,
you are.
I am.
Perfect. Thank you for your comments. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening. My name's David Smith. I'm also with Responsible Growth in Marin, and I live in Northgate area. And I want to talk about congestion. Congestion's important for a lot of reasons, primarily safety, response times for fire trucks, paramedics, ambulances, emergency evacuation routes, something that we've all become very aware of in the last couple of years. Business vitality is hurt by congestion. Can your customers get to you? People's health and the planet's welfare. Somebody mentioned earlier this evening about greenhouse gases. The state, by imposing VMT, seems to think that all vehicle miles are equal, but we know that simply isn't true. Air pollution and greenhouse gases from idling cars stuck in traffic going nowhere is much worse per mile than vehicles traveling at highway speeds. So LOS is not really contrary to environmental goals as was stated in the June 3rd staff report. It actually encourages the reduction of exhaust emissions in the neighborhoods where people live. And conversely, VMT would encourage more exhaust spewing vehicles in those neighborhoods. The other debate is LOS intersections versus LOS arterial, and we think that LOS measured at intersections is actually a better measure of traffic congestion in neighborhoods than the arterial delay index. For residents who live in neighborhoods, traffic being stuck at intersections is what's important. Simply speeding traffic along arterials into neighborhoods so that it then backs up at the intersections and clogs the side streets is simply papering over the problem. For example, traffic coming off 101 for the Northgate Mall is completely uncontrolled until it gets to either the Freitas interchange or the Merrydale overcrossing. And if Freitas is designated as an arterial and the main goal is to reduce congestion on that road so that arterial speed is not affected, the only solution is to move traffic off Freitas onto the surrounding smaller streets as quickly as possible, but this simply makes congestion worse. I'm out of time, but thank you for listening.
And thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for your time. My name is Lori Perini, and I live in Terra Linda. And one thing that came to mind while I was sitting there was Mayor Phillips talking about people coming from Terra Linda and if they're going to Novato versus they're only going to have to go to Northgate for Costco. So one of the things that it made me think about, and I'm sure these numbers are way off, but I'm just going to throw broad numbers out there for you. If we have 100,000 customers going to Novato, and 50,000 of those are coming up from Southern Marin to go to Terra Linda Costco. I imagine that the rest of the customers in Novato will come south to Terra Linda for the gas. So now we have all 100,000 customers coming from Novato to Terra Linda. And when you want to talk about vehicle miles traveled, one of the things that Costco has said in the last couple of meetings is they do expect customers to come from San Francisco. So if they're coming from Sunset in San Francisco to Terra Linda, where those vehicle miles traveled are more so than what we would save if they're not coming now. So that's just something I thought about. Thank you again for your time.
And thank you.
Hi, my name is Shirley Fisher. I'm a Terra Linda resident of 40 years and also a member of Responsible Growth Marin. My few comments tonight are to emphasize the importance of maintaining both the arterial and the intersection LOS standards and methodologies in the general plan. As other people have said, congestion is important. The state studies don't really count how congestion affects greenhouse gases. So I think the city has a responsibility to think of that. But even more so, we have a necessity to think of how it really impacts our communities. I was driving on right at 3:15 today when Terralinda High School gets out. I was driving up Los Ranchitos. It was bumper-to-bumper traffic from Golden Hind all the way to North San Pedro Road. Okay, because it lasts 10, 15 minutes. The photo you have in front of you, it was taken in 1991, part of a presentation that was made to the City Council before the Meridale Overcrossing was built and before the new northbound on-ramp to 101 was built. This shows the backup of traffic from the intersection all the way along Freitas Parkway. And this was every day, morning, noon, and night congestion. It was something that was a part of our lives. This is the kind of thing you will see again when you increase traffic to the point where people can no longer cross that dysfunctional intersection. I think the city has the important to maintain. The other thing you may need to know is that currently in your general plan, the city traffic engineer can decide whether to use arterial methods which count the speed on the arterials, or whether you use intersection LOS, which counts the backup. In suburban areas outside of downtown, the backup is much more important. Traffic flows freely until it hits a stop sign, as it does in Golden Hind, or a stoplight, as it does around Northgate. It's important to maintain both of those. It's also important to look at cumulative traffic effects, not just the effects of large projects. You got a bunch of small projects in, and all of a sudden your traffic congestion has increased, even though you haven't required them to do traffic studies. So we recommend that you do not exempt people from traffic studies for size of project or when it and timing wise, and whether it decreases the arterial LOS or not. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop.
Thanks, Shirley.
Did that wrong. Mayor Phillips, council members, Ken Dickinson, Raphael Meadows, Neighborhood, and Responsible Growth Marin. Who's on first, who's on second here? Makes me think of that story. Responsible Growth Marin, we would like to strongly recommend that the City of San Rafael retain an enforceable version of development timing policies as currently outlined in the 2020 plan under Section Land Use 2. Some provisions of the existing policy may need to be updated, but its general principles should be maintained. Ongoing accurate assessment of local traffic conditions is essential for San Rafael to anticipate what circulation improvements are needed and in what time frame. As stated in LU2, for health, safety and general welfare reasons, new development should occur only where adequate infrastructure is available and that circulation improvements triggered by the development are substantially in process with funding committed. We feel that this is particularly important for the suburban areas of San Rafael outside of downtown, where precise plans are not in effect to direct growth and where there is no overlying environmental assessments as in the downtown precise plan. So again, while some of the land use policy LU2 may need to be updated or adjusted, it is important to maintain a link between the timing of circulation of transportation improvements and construction of new development, particularly large projects. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ken.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
It's a lot to listen to with dogs and all. My name's Phil Hallstein. I'm a Terra Linda resident for 25 years and a member of the Responsible Growth in Marin. So basically I'm here to just put in a bid to have a North San Rafael specific plan developed. It was part of a staff report a little while ago. You're looking at the canal and Northgate, and we believe that there's an important gain that can be made from making a very specific plan, not leaving it general. So really want to recommend that happen. A lot of changes have happened in San Rafael. New additions have shown up. The Gateway Walk, Northgate Walk, new buildings all around. couple people have mentioned, a lot of congestion on the roadways, and we think it's appropriate to do that. There's been 6 different plans that have been made in Northgate since 1980. I can give you the years, but I'm not going to use my time to do that. So the people there care a lot about having very concrete plans and do planning up there. So we just want to make sure we get that in as part of the general plan. We have some people who are participating in the general plan conversation and want to make sure that Northgate is considered as a specific plan to really design what we need up there. It's a great neighborhood. We want to keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it is mentioned in the report, so.
Good evening. My name is Petra Fless, and I'm a resident of Terralinda and a member of Responsible Growth in Marin. I would like to speak to our concerns and the letter that we sent earlier today regarding VMT transportation policies. Our comments were not made to the 15% you mentioned. They were not made to bolster our arguments and distort it. Rather, they result from the lack of an in-depth explanation, discussion, or any accompanying source material in the progress report. The progress report simplified the 15% issue. That's why we compared it to the original source material to the per capita. I would like to draw your attention to that graph again. The gentleman said it was 6% above the Bay Area average. If you look at it, it's barely a percent above. So I also questioned the 30% of employment-based averaged. So one of our concerns is that the City Council does not have the benefit of reviewing the underlying methodologies, the assumptions, and the conclusions for the proposed policies. We do not feel that the Council currently has adequate information to make recommendations regarding the VMT methodology. Hold on. Got all scrambled up. For example, the Transportation Policy 2 recommends this alternative to adopting the VMT reduction rates of about 15% below existing regional averages, which are recommended by 2 state agencies in order to meet California's greenhouse gas reduction goals. I would like to call on Jerry Engel to cede his minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We understand that the city has the discretion of setting its own threshold for purposes of secret review, but we have several concerns. For one, this issue of the VMT above the regional average. Are we talking about Marin or Bay Area average? We're slightly above the Bay Area average, but way below the Marin average. Which one do we use? What's more concerning is the approach of using a less onerous target simply to reduce the number of projects that are subject to a quantitative VMT analysis. This removes the City Council's options to deny a project or to require feasible mitigation. This approach appears to undermine both the CEQA process and is not consistent with the intent of SB 743. Thank you. A little late. Well, we request that the transportation policies for the VMT methodology be placed on the agenda for a future meeting to allow for more complete consideration by both the council and the public, and requests that the underlying methodologies are made available. We also request that the methodologies outlined in the future progress report for that meeting are supported by substantial evidence. Thank you for listening.
And thanks for your comments, and we will be exploring this in more detail, I can assure you. Anyone else? Bill, good evening.
Excuse me, I thought there was someone else in front of me. Bill Carney with Sustainable San Rafael. Earlier comments on the downtown precise plan we shared with you a month or so ago, and hope you'll keep considering those. Also, I think the idea of a further plan in the Northgate area is a very good idea to build on the stationary plan that was done up there a few years ago. On the transportation, there clearly are a lot of moving parts in these equations. And I would urge the city and its consultants to really continue working diligently to bring back to you something that really works with this new imperative of VMTs, really works towards achieving its purposes, which is a reduction of traffic and thereby the reduction of greenhouse gases, and with a side benefit of encouraging development in areas that are already developed, downtown and close to transit. So these are all good things. I think by moving with the parts here, we can come up with a solution that really works to achieve those goals. But keep those goals in mind as while going through all the technicalities involved. For instance, I was particularly drawn to the mitigation slides. I mean, if you have a significant finding of significance, the solution to that is to mitigate. And those mitigations are addressing the problems that are raised. So, and you know, there are ways of doing this: trip reduction strategies, transportation demand management, and fees themselves, and applying those fees to transit, for instance, and other ways of giving people options. The roads are not going to get any wider significantly. We're not going to build our way out of this in that regard. We're not going to stop growing. We've got to figure out how to put more people in fewer vehicles, and that's transit, basically, or to keep them walking and biking. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Anybody else? Yes, John.
John Reynolds from the Canal. I'm not up to date on all this, but the issue is, if you have businesses like Costco going in, and people have talked about that, have housing associated with it, have housing close to where people work, that would help with the congestion issue. And maybe I'm behind the curve on this, but sounds like a possibility that we can still work with.
And thank you, John. Anyone else? Close public and come back for further comment and specifically addressing some of the issues that were requested of us to comment upon. Starting with anyone? Andrew.
Yeah. I just want to make one comment about what we've heard today. When I got the letter from Responsible Growth in Marin, I was a little skeptical because I was really worried that a very parochial view, that is one very much focused on the Northgate Mall and the impact of a Costco coming potentially in the future, was going to threaten to hijack what should have been a higher level discussion, and that hasn't happened actually in my view. I've heard some very interesting things, some of which were articulated in a different way in the letter, but I do appreciate what I've heard today, and it's helped me think a little more clearly about the Northgate Mall specifically, and I'm very intrigued by it, although it isn't one of the things we're being asked to weigh in on. I'm very intrigued by the idea of a specific plan for the Northgate Mall area and Terra Linda more broadly, but the Northgate area. That said, I find much to agree with in the recommendations that we see in the staff report and that are itemized up on the screen right now. As to that question, and I'm forgetting now who posed it best, but several have, about why would we want to raise the VMT target to one that's locally based as opposed to the regional average. I think it's because, as was sort of referenced earlier, perhaps by our consultant, or in the staff report rather, because we always have the opportunity, if the matter comes to us, to weigh in on a project that may or may not meet the thresholds, the CEQA thresholds. We can weigh in on it, but what I would not want to see is to have every project require an override just so we can get through a process. And I'm really worried that if we set a standard that is so far above or below what is reasonable, then we're going to be looking at every project in this light So I think staff's recommendation makes sense here. And the example, and it certainly wasn't raised for that reason, but the example, Mayor, that you brought up and that I elaborated on a little bit about where the vehicle miles emanate from using Costco as the proposed Northgate Costco as the example, is particularly vexing because if we've got traffic coming from all over Marin, it just shows you how VMT is such an imprecise way to figure this out. And on a regional basis, it's further, I mean, Rafat, you talked about, we're not going to achieve real granularity with VMT. Well, we're certainly not when we look at it on a regional basis. Looking at it on a local basis gives us a lot more control over what we're trying to accomplish, I believe. So on number one, that's my view. I do think, although I remain a little perplexed about LOS as a valuable tool, I think that it can be a useful tool, at least for the near term going forward. I would hate to lose some of the kind of legacy considerations that come along with it. And since it is so well known to folks, and as some of the comments highlighted here today for particular projects going forward, it may be an important additional tool to determine how the project should be conditioned should it come forward and be facing approval. I think that's certainly relevant to consider. And then on trip-based mitigation fees, I think I'm in agreement. We didn't talk about that this evening at all. And the staff report, it maybe doesn't give it quite as much treatment as it would. But whether it's trip-based or whether it's, what do you call it, infrastructure, I'm forgetting the alternatives in the staff report, it probably makes sense, but I think that's something we want to revisit on a regular basis. So those are my comments.
Thank you very much. Maribeth?
I'm in substantial agreement with Councilman Vice Mayor McCullough. My concern, though, underlying the vehicle miles traveled is the TAM model. I've been professionally associated with models, worked with them, and models in the mathematical form. Simplifying assumptions are made, biases are put in, not intentionally, but I'm very concerned that we would turn over our transportation planning to a model that we didn't build and don't fully understand. So that's my concern. That dovetails into why I think we should keep level of service planning as a planning tool, a tool in our toolkit, if only for maybe some rough comparison purposes, and in particularly different locations in the more suburban parts of San Rafael. And I think it's really essential that we use a locally based vehicle miles traveled target, or we're going to find ourselves in the predicament of, as Andrew described, having to do findings, overriding findings every time we want to get something built. So that's where I am. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. John?
Yeah. I again echo the comments of the council members and vice mayor on this. As a resident of North San Rafael, I do believe that we should look at a precise plan for that because it is such a distinct neighborhood and area. Once you cross that hill, things change a lot. So I would be fully supportive of that. I agree as well to retaining the LOS as a planning tool, especially in areas outside of the downtown, where I think that downtown could use the VMT to very well, but outside of downtown, having LOS as an additional tool when we're looking at projects is something I think we need to retain. And again, on the trip-based mitigation fees, just some more information on that, obviously. But that's all I've got.
Thanks, John. Here.
Well, thank you for everyone who came down to talk about this topic, which is new to all of us and is very, as we said, simple but complex. I concur with many of the comments that my colleagues have already said. It does make sense to have a specific plan up in North San Rafael. There have been many of them, but looking at that, in addition, it wasn't talked about tonight, but the Canal neighborhood would be another neighborhood that I think could use some additional study. The VMT is required by the state, so we're going to have to deal with this tool one way or another, and I think having us ease into it makes sense, and having the hybrid approach and continuing to use LOS where it makes sense. And when we step back and look at potential development in San Rafael, the reality is up in Northgate is some, downtown, so let's use the tools that make the most sense. And I'm persuaded by the comments that I heard that LOS really does get at that congestion idling. They're almost measuring different things. As Andrew said, there's a tension between the two of them, but that to me really gets at that quality of life, gets at what's the experience that people want to have in their community as they're moving through it. So having LOS utilized up there makes sense. And in the downtown, and I guess it would still be LOS or not LOS, we already know the information about those intersections. There's not going to be much, even with additional growth there. I mean, I don't want us to be spending money and time on intersections. We already really know the information. We've already studied it, and there's not as much growth. Does that make sense? Okay. So I guess in terms of the actual numbers, agree with what has already been mentioned. To always be doing the overriding consideration doesn't make sense. So a locally based VMT. Again, it's a strange tool, so let's use it in a way that makes sense for the type of development we want to have, and we'll revisit it as the years go by and see how it gets fleshed out. LOS is a planning tool. I referred to that already. And again, I think it makes sense on the intersection versus the arterials for up in North San Rafael. I mean, great examples were already given. I don't need to repeat those. And retain the trip-based mitigation fees. Actually, Rafat and I had a conversation this afternoon on the phone because I had the same comment that Andrew did, like, well, you know, what are we talking about here? And I will just share with the conversation, I gotta find my notes, that you in our conversation, we're not really sure how VMT is gonna be playing out for the smaller, bigger projects. So if this is what I wrote, is that we should continue with how it currently is set up until we see what the effect is. For us to be changing it now when we're not sure what we'd be changing doesn't make sense. So that was a compelling comment. I did not say it as beautifully as we did on the phone, but it does make sense, and we'll continue to revisit it as we go forward. So thank you.
And thank you. One of the nice things about speaking last is everything's been covered. Let me give you a sense where I'm at on this. VMT obviously is upon us, and therefore we're going to have to work with it, and I suspect will evolve in our understanding and application as we go along. So for me, it's a little premature to specify 15% or 10 or whatever it might be, because I don't know the consequences. We will in due course, but at this point, I think the message is there's a lot more that we need to understand in terms of not the mechanics, but rather the consequence. That's the part that I don't have a good sense of. We might know our objective, and how does this match with that objective, particularly in the areas discussed, that is the downtown and Terra Linda in particular. So I need to know more about that before I come up with a percent that I'm comfortable with, and maybe the basis as well, locally or otherwise. LOS makes sense to me to continue it for all the reasons cited. To me, it measured something quite a lot different than VMT, and quite frankly, most of our residents, seems to me, are primarily concerned about congestion, particularly in downtown, and therefore this is a tool we have to quantify what that looks like and make decisions thereupon. And so I think it would be a mistake to eliminate LOS at this point in time until maybe some future date. I don't know when that is, if in fact VMT also addresses that issue, and I don't think it does, or I don't see how it does. So therefore I think that LOS should be continued in our application process, so we make the best decision that we might possibly make. Reference was made to the Terra Linda precise plan. Sure, lots happening there. We know that the mall is going to significantly change in its current configuration, and so therefore to better prepare that important part of the community, I think it'd be good to look at it. We haven't done it for a while, and so with the possibility of the mall changing in a significant way, I think it's not appropriate for us to get out ahead of that and define what it is we would prefer to have at that location, because certainly something's going to happen. We know that. And traffic mitigation, I'm sort of in favor of continuing it because we've accumulated some funds and we've used those funds well. I think maybe we should revisit that, as Kate mentioned, to make sure that we are, in fact, aligning the fees to that, what we're wishing to change to accomplish something. And I'm not sure that that's as connected as perhaps I either recall or would like to see. So maybe now is an appropriate time in a package sense to address that as well, to make sure, you know, we're in the right place. Maybe we're low, maybe we're high, maybe we're not, you know, accomplishing what we intended to, and should scrap it all together. I'm pretty open on that point. And so let's get into that a little bit more in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve. So those are basically my comments. Any follow-up by anyone?
If I could?
Andrew, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to make a motion here shortly, but I did want to make one other comment, actually two, if I could. One is, actually it's a question, the first one. Would the delay or congestion index be to the exclusion of an intersection LOS analysis? In other words, does one preclude the other?
I'm sorry, is this a question? I mean, what is the question?
Yes, it's a question.
Okay.
So we have an audience here, many of whom said they'd like to see intersection level LOS remain the basis for the analysis. And in the staff report, there's a suggestion that, and it's up here, that congestion-based LOS should be viewed in the future.
We can definitely do both. Actually, one of the speaker mentioned that we currently have the option to select the level of analysis once we know what the project is, depending on the size of the project, depending on the location of the project. So, I mean, I think we should keep all the tools in the toolbox, and there's a conceptual difference here between keeping the level of service analysis as the analysis basis, and there's another thing to keep the level of service as the threshold for significance. And we will always, I mean, with all of the review of the traffic study, we need to be highly transparent as to explain to the general public what would be the impact, and the decision makers, what would be the impact of a certain project. So we should keep all of the tools in the toolbox. The decision here and the nuances between selecting the level of service as a tool versus as a significance threshold would determine whether we come to you for every time we exceed the level of service X, or right now it's D. So do you want us to come back to you with every time we exceed the level of service D, whether it's an intersection or at the level, at an arterial, is something that we will, you know, we'll craft and come back to you with. And I totally agree with that. We need to know more about before we select that threshold, because that's going to be the bar. When we exceed it, we're here. When we don't exceed it, we're not here. And if I may just make one more comment about, you know, I heard a lot of comments about the waiving of and the selection and this screening. We currently do screening. We don't require a traffic study for every little project, infill project. And we use a rule of thumb of 150 AM and PM peak hour trips. That is a much higher tolerance that we're actually recommending, or what came in the OPR recommendation of 110 daily trips. So I don't think we're going far from what we're doing already. But I hope I answered your question.
You did, actually, and it makes my next comment much simpler, which is if we're going to keep, for example, both sides of this LOS equation as part of our future planning, I just want to sound a little note of caution that by retaining LOS as a planning tool but adopting VMT as part of our CEQA analysis, we're not compounding problems for developers. In other words, I think we need to chart this as clearly and as transparently as possible so that someone who comes into our community with a project that is worthwhile by all accounts or most accounts, and it's something desired by the community, that we don't put up hurdles simply because we've created a process that is very cumbersome and that requires a lot of boxes to be checked, and we scare away good projects at the same time that we also hold projects to account that justify close scrutiny. So that's my note of concern. I would like to make a motion unless someone...
Please do. Let me check. Any other comments? Go right ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, that we accept the report and that we approve the resolution regarding membership as recommended by staff.
Second.
Moved and second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Councilmember Cullen.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Vice Mayor McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, matter carries 5-0. Thank you very much, everyone. And, let's see. We'll now turn to, well, let's see, council members' reports.
So,
Do we have the agreement, the bond agreement?
so,
It follows.
yeah, follow. So,
Oh, that follows by.
So-
Following the agenda. picture.
very briefly, the week before Thanksgiving, I attended the initial initiative or initial event for the Not in Our Town San Rafael. And we are working with many, many partner agencies. I won't go all into it here. And the initial event was at San Rafael High School, and it was comprised of having local students who are in San Rafael, who are actually Guatemalan, talk about their immigrant stories. And we also had one of our firefighter, Angel Landaverde, was part of the panel at the end and talked about his own immigrant experience. And it was really just a conversation about how we all ended up here. And it was wonderful. So I'm glad that San Rafael is partnering with the Not in Our Town group, as well as, who else is part of it? Congregation Rodef Shalom, the JCC, San Rafael High School, San Rafael Police Department, Sheriff's Department, District Attorney. So there's a lot of people in the room really to have conversations that are to so we get to know each other and to have decreased incidences of hate and violence and bullying in our community. That's the ultimate goal, which is one of our stated goals for 2019-2020. So just wanted to know that that kickoff event occurred, and there will be more events, and I'll be sure to let you all know about it.
Very good. Thank you very much. John, I'll just mention a couple of things. Today, Jim didn't mention his report, but today we had a meeting of a number of people in connection with the Downtown Transit Center, including Golden Gate and 3 supervisors and FARAD, et cetera. That's moving along. It's moving along in a fashion I would be curious, let's say, with the outcome. And I'll leave it at that. It's interesting. I also met the wildfire committee for the campaign. That was last week. That's coming together, and you'll be hearing more about that, fundraising at this point, and promoting, of course, the wildfire countywide. So stay tuned, really critical. And enjoyed the Parade of Lights Friday. It was a wonderful event without rain, as we had last year, and great turnout, so that was great fun. So, and there was some other stuff sprinkled in, but that's the fun stuff. Let's now move to San Rafael Successor Agency Modification of the Agreement. That must be Lisa?
We could, if you'd like, we have it listed as a consent calendar item unless the council has any specific questions.
I'd like to make a motion
Thank you.
that we adopt the resolution.
Move and second. Roll call, please.
Can we please take public comment first?
Oh.
Say again?
Public comment first?
Oh, I'm sorry. Any public comment on this item? Don't rush us all at once. Close the public. And now we'll go to vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Member Bushy? Member Cullen?
Aye.
Member Gamblin?
Aye.
Vice Chair McCullough?
Aye.
Chairman Phillips?
Matter carries 5-0. Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Thanks, everybody, for